We should be waiting for two more people, then we can get started officially. It should be somebody named Hari, and then Yusuf is here too. Okay, cool. Hari just joined. Then let me just ask Sandy if she's joining too. So let's get started at 4:05. I'm just gonna wait for I think at least one more person has to come. But if they're not, if they're not here right there, we can just get started. Y'all can feel free to either put questions as we go on the chat, or come off mute and just ask it right away. I may have a little bit of lag just because of the nature of Wi-Fi and Zoom calls, but feel free to do either of those. And like, if y'all want to turn off your cams, that's fine. If you want to keep them on, that's fine. Either works. I don't care. I'm not a teacher. Okay, it's 4:05. So is everyone good to go? Just give me a thumbs up in the chat or something like that. Just let me know that everyone's ready here. Reactions would be great. Okay, cool. There's also like a reaction button if that works, but anything is fine. So I guess the first thing we're going to start on is what is Afropessimism? And I was reading an article from Wilderson and Terefe, and the quote I had for what is Afropessimism is this: Afropessimism is a lens of interpretation that accounts for civil society's dependence on anti-Black violence. I'll repeat that again because I think it's a useful understanding for how we will go about this sort of lecture. Afropessimism is a lens of interpretation that accounts for civil society's dependence on anti-Black violence. The way I'm interpreting this is sort of that Blackness functions as sort of an origin point for how we understand the world in relationship to it. I think this, on the level of abstraction, seems pretty difficult to understand, but I think a useful analytic to understand this would be, imagine a graph, right? Like you have your X and Y axis, and on the X axis, and let's set the origin point as Blackness, right? Then we can draw a grid of where other identity lines fall upon, and each of them have a certain relationship to Blackness. The further away an identity point gets from Blackness, i.e. white, straight, male, etc., the less deviant they're viewed by civil society. This is sort of the project of meaning making that we're going to be discussing today, about how Blackness offers the sort of an originary conception for us to understand meaning of other identity groups, which implicates then Reformism. The second tenet of Afropessimism is that the progress is the horizon of equilibrium that disavows the gratuitous nature of anti-black violence. Uh, so what does gratuity or gratuitous violence mean? I know it's a buzz phrase a lot of people have heard a debate, but basically it means that there's sort of a violence that happens without reason, right? There is no rationale for understanding why certain aspects of anti-black violence happens, right? So there's a litany of examples of this. I'm not going to go into each one of them, but like as you can probably tell on TV, we see like just instances of violence that are unexplainable for why they happened or why they keep repeating and happening. So there's an inarticulable grammar for why violence gets accentuated onto the black body. And the argument that then is made is that the idea of progress or reformism disavows how there is not an explanatory grammar for those things to happen. Let me just break that down a little bit more because while this may seem like really, really just conceptual, it directly implicates how reformism gets put into action, right? If we are right about this gratuitous nature of anti-black violence, then the sort of cause and effect solutions that policy proposals offer can never come to grips with the way that violence operates, right? Because if there's no reason for why violence all happens, how can that violence ever be sort of solved? And this is the sort of nexus question that Afropessimist authors sort of forward. Next, we're going to talk about the sort of what's the core principle of Afropessimism, and this will filter the two things we talked about above. And here's where we're going to start getting into the more meaty portion. So bear with me for a little bit. The first principle of Afropessimism is that humanity is made legible through an irreconcilable distinction between humans and blackness. Now, this may seem like a weird statement, right? Because obviously we can say that we all are, a human because we all have sort of biological functions that act. Afro-pessimists say that human is not something just purely biological, but rather is something that's something that has to do with the project of sentience, right? Who has the ability to have autonomy over their own self? Who has the ability to, think for themselves, to act for themselves, to be treated as a human, right? Human is more of a racially codified term that was constructed through the understanding of what blackness is not. So first, let's kind of go into the history of that and how we can prove that to be true. So let's start at the Middle Passage, as Afro-pessimist authors do, where Black folks were ripped from Africa and taken across the Middle Passage to what was now known as the Americas. This process was a sort of ripping of cultural identity from the African to reduce them to Black, right? It's a reason why cultural ties got lost, and there was just no sort of return back, because when they were ripped apart, they were forced to unlearn everything that they had been taught in their own country by the sort of slave master, etc. This experience is known as natal alienation, and it's one of the three pillars of social debt that you've probably heard. There's a really, really good biography that sort of reflects on this. If you have the time, I'd strongly recommend to read the works of Saidiya Hartman in Lose Your Mother and How to Lose Your Mother, where she kind of talks about how she had this alienating experience between when she returned back to Ghana, where she thought her family was originally from, and her experience there. She did not have the sort of cultural know-how to be reintegrated back. She was casted as separate and therefore will never have a sort of genuine connection to her own culture. Right? So that was the first part, the stripping of cultural identity. Then it was the reduction of slaves to be a literal commodity. My bad. Then it was the reduction of slaves to like a literal commodity, right? That they were no longer humans, but once they were in the slave boat or the wake of the boat, they got reduced to a commodity to be exchanged, a literal source of profit that was then traded in order for them to, gain coherence. So that is an the first instance that Afro-pessimist authors would indicate of blackness being reduced to a fungible thing, a commodity. Uh, so then how do we get to the present day? When the slaves came to America, uh, they had to finally come to grips with what is human, what is freedom, what is what are these things that American ideals are built upon, and how do we understand those things? And the only way those sort of terms gain coherency is through the antagonism of the slave, right? We cannot define what freedom is without knowing what unfreedom is or captivity is. We cannot define what it means to be a free person without knowing what slave is. We cannot define what liberation, what freedom means without knowing what is the captive body, right? These sort of grammars set the basis for civil society to understand how they relate to one another. And then, like, the very, very first thing we came to agree upon are that the slaves were not human, right? They were considered in a distinct category. When you think to historical things like the 3/5 clause, it kind of proves the way that historically Black folks were never actually seen as human, which is why there's a sort of dialectical antagonism between the human and Blackness. So that's sort of the history portion of it. But how does that implicate our society now? The problem is when we have that sort of dialectical antagonism of how we sort of found civil society and create these grammars, it gets replicated in our everyday grammar. So as we started creating new words and new phrases and new methods of describing things, it was all built upon that original statement of freedom, humanity, etc. That original grammar was the foundation of how we were able to understand all the other words that came to our vocabulary. So every other piece of our grammatical relationship was already founded on a system of anti-Blackness. So over time, as we just forget about these racialized codes and the way that these grammars are not value neutral, but racialized, it is built up over time and accumulates and makes us start thinking in anti-Black ways. This process is like a very common observation in like behavioral psychology. It's like if I was to call you silly or if I said you weren't smart every day of your life, you'd likely internalize this. If I said your entire family wasn't smart every day of their life, they'd internalize this. And as we do this for a process of like centuries and decades, it then becomes intergenerational and locks itself implicitly in our minds. Right. So this is the one explanation for the libidinal economy that I've really enjoyed or I've really understood better, because it's saying that because of the repetition of an anti-Black system of grammars, they've instilled in us a cognitive way of a cognitive thing, a slippage. Yeah, Nora, everyone will get access to the recording after. It causes a cognitive slippage where people now start to think in anti-Black ways. And it doesn't even happen consciously, right? Because we've indoctrinated for so long. It happens in what is known as our unconscious, right? The stuff that we can't really control. So that's a sort of basis for the Lacanian interpretation of the libidinal economy for Afropessimism. So given that, let's fast forward to what's happening right now and like the current day. What does this mean for Blackness in the status quo? It means that Blackness has never actually been freed or uncaptive, but rather is still held in the place of fungibility or captivity or commodification. So what does this mean? Fungibility is the reduction of something into a commodity. This is probably the most important distinction in Afropessimism and from what you've heard in your debates, because it says that Blackness is not ontological, but rather hyperfluid, mobilized only in its potential to define, but rather that humanity is the one that is ontological, that is rigid, that is never going to be able to be inclusive of Blackness because it relies on its exclusion in order to understand what humanity is. So is everyone with me so far? Any questions? Feel free to speak up, comments, concerns. Cool. Tanish, Adarsh, Hari, Yusuf, Sandy. Okay, I'm gonna. Okay, yeah. So if we go back, yeah. So the way we understand blackness is through the whole fungibility stuff as a commodity, right? Uh, if blackness is then a commodity of exchange, then its value, or why it is valued as a commodity, is in its ability to define other things or what other things are not, right? So blackness gains value because it's the opposite of freedom. It's the opposite of human. It's the opposite of things that we'd normally associate with being positive, right? Like, let's even take the fashion industry, right? People, there's a huge scheme of colorism, right? Where whiteness is sort of viewed as more beautiful, but blackness is not. Blackness is the sort of conceptual anchor that defines the opposite of what is good. Then, if we understand that blackness to be mobilized for any purpose as a meaning-making project, then humanity has to be ontological because it can never include blackness, if that makes sense. All right, let me know if that made sense to you, or if you need me to explain it again. Okay, cool. So using this theory of power, we can come to say that the structure of anti-blackness has changed, but the violence that is interwoven between has remained the same. We can come to say that change is happening, but rather is overcoded by blackness. Ontology, or the relationship to ontology, or the lack of it, is built through words and relationships. So this was the sort of grammar stuff we were talking about above, which is the sort of reason why we're able to go from slavery to sharecropping to Jim Crow to the prison industrial complex to Trump. Has the structure changed? Sure. But has the violence that's being interwoven between those two things changed? The answer to that is what Afropessimists are gonna claim. No. Uh, the whole point of this is that every time we've seen reform, because of the sort of nature of blackness being mobilized for the purpose of meaning making and to build up civil society, we always rely the objection of blackness, right? Because otherwise, what would the human be, right? How do we understand our own identities without the conceptual anchor of blackness? Because at that point, freedom would literally not exist. The ideas of freedom, liberation, human, your own identity could not be coherent if you did not understand what it was not. So, in order for us to have coherent identities of what is human, what am I, what are you, it always relies on an originary violence upon blackness to provide that conceptual anchor. Does that stuff make sense? Okay. So now we sort of come to the question of reformism and its interaction with this theory. We sort of hinted at it, but there's a couple of things. The problem with reformism, right? I have about 6 different things, so we can just go through those one by one. So first is iconography. Uh, So if we think of blackness only being utilized insofar as it can produce meaning, we see that the violence of against black folks, the way especially it's being displayed in the media, is always used as a melancholic drama to be able to justify an ends, right? It's never that, hey, here's violence and that's why it's bad, but rather, here's violence, so do this, or here's violence, therefore do this. I think a great example of this was, I think a really easy example to conceptualize this off of is when you see those advertisements on TV that are like, help St. Jude's Hospital, children are dying, we really need your help, right? That sort of theory is what is being problematized by Afropessimists, because the argument they are making is not that those people had a sort of genuine interest in mitigating anti-blackness, but rather the call and response of that, right? Or the demand for a response to black suffering is the reduction of it to a fungible commodity to be exchanged. Blackness no longer is valuable because of its existence, but is valuable in its ability to produce things, to labor for things, to for civil society, for individuals in order to feel good. Does that part make sense? Any questions on the iconography stuff? Yeah. So if you think of TV, right, where people are beckoning images of black suffering, it's never in sort of like, hey, we have to have like a genuine engagement with this, or hey, this is how we're going to do things, but rather there's always an external motive that those images are utilized for in order to justify, right? It's always this is the sort of stuff that Wilderson talks about when he's like, uh, from equilibrium to disequilibrium, right? Images of black suffering is utilized to offer a moment of disequilibrium, but then they have a solution for you or something that they want that will pretend to be an equilibrium. So you will think that you have done something, but if our theory of power that we talked about above is correct, then that doing something doesn't actually do anything, but rather is a reduction of blackness to just be a commodity for people to exchange in order to get a feel-good sentiment. Okay, so I hope that maybe cleared it up a little bit. Okay, cool. I just saw your message. Uh, so that's my first sort of critique of reformism. I know it doesn't directly implicate the action of reform, but it implicates the process of reformism, which I think, especially for those debating, is going to be is going to be an important distinction for y'all to make. Because if you're right that the process of which they inculcate reform is anti-black, they should probably be beholden to it if you're right about the framework debate, right? It's the age-old question of, do the ends justify the means or do the means justify the ends? Uh, I think that especially Afro-pessimists would say that the way we sort of have linguistic constructs and the way we talk about things overcodes our relationship to consequences, which is why we should focus especially first on the way we linguistically talk about things, right? And that gets back to the sort of grammar stuff at the beginning. The second critique of reformism that I have is known as affective amelioration. And I know this sounds like two really big words, but I'll break them down for you first. So affect is the sort of experience, vibe, sense of, it's a very Deleuzian concept, right? That there are certain emotions that we are felt in the presence of things. That when we talk about things, they're not neutral, but rather make us feel a certain way. So that's what we call affect. And then amelioration is the way we're able to resolve ourselves of some said affect. So affective amelioration would mean the way that we're able to resolve ourselves of the guilt that we have been complicit in. And I'll explain why I think reformism is this. So and I'll make this contextualized to the stuff that's going on right now. So I don't know how many of y'all have done like the repost to sign X petition thing or repost to do this thing, right? We can make a real change. Y'all need to do some actual work and stuff like that. That is what Wilderson, Warren, etc. would all call an example of affective amelioration, where we see a problem and in the solution of it, we think we have done something. This shifts the guilt off of our body that makes us feel like, hey, we already did our part. We no longer need to do anything. And this is the sort of problem with reformism, right? Once we see a reform go into place, we think, hey, we've done the right thing. We've already solved the problem. I think a really good example of this is the idea of police cameras. So after shootings and cop killings in 2014, they decided to place cop cameras on officers in the Obama administration. The problem with this was that cop cameras did not actually reduce violence that happened, but rather provided two things. A, it provided an alternative method of surveillance of Black and brown communities, but B, it always filmed the person opposite to the cop, right? There would not be a camera facing the cop, it would be facing outwards. So what this would do is that in court cases, the camera would then be focused on the other person to make the people that were being policed be viewed as the actual criminal ones, etc. This resulted in an actual increase in incarceration of Black folks, right? But we had all felt that we had done something good to ameliorate the issue of anti-Blackness, or to help take a step in the right direction of sort of police brutality. The reason why this is important is because when you talk about things in debate especially, right, nothing actually gets implemented. Obviously, we all can agree fiat doesn't exist, whatever, they'll do their education stuff. But the fact that no real action has been taken into place is sort of proof of the affective amelioration argument, because it makes judges feel like they have done something good or that they have done something productive for their ballot, when in fact that thing was not productive at all, has not done anything, and trades off with like a genuine focus on the antagonism of Blackness. So that's a sort of trade-off argument, but it's also an impact claim, because it allows for white and non-Black folks to claim a veil of innocence, like, hey, I'm not embedded in the structure because I've done good things, or I'm the anti-racist, when in fact the sort of coalitions that get constructed are violent. Questions on that part of the debate, the affective amelioration critique of reformism? I'm going to take that as a no. So I'm just going to warn all of you. This meeting is going to end in 10 minutes, but then I'm going to create another meeting. And if you use the same code, it should still be able to get you in. Yeah, so Adarsh, you're right insofar that it's like reformism hides the power structures at hand. Uh, but I think it distinguishes from settler colonialism in the sort of implication of it, right? Because settler colonialism would say that it disavows the metric in which genocide happens, but but Afropessimism theory would say that, you know, this sort of refusal or affective amelioration is sort of proof of the way that they have casted Blackness as fungible, right? Or reduced Blackness to just be a commodity for things such as ballots, votes, etc., and things that they've utilized in order to justify their impact. So yeah, the affective amelioration stuff is a little bit more generic, but I think it's a lot more based on the Speech Act than sort of normative settler colonialism, reformism critiques. Uh, I also think, Adarsh, that there's a very, very good intersection between settler colonialism and Afropessimism, especially on the question of reformism. Uh, you should read the works of Tiffany King. She just dropped a new book co-authored by Andrea Smith, but what's the book name? Tiffany King. It should be, I was reading it last night. It should be called like New Worlds or something. I'll send the link once I can find it, but it's just not popping up right now. But I think that has a sort of really, really good intersection between the way that settler colonialism functions as well as anti-Blackness, especially in the context of Reformism. The next thing I have, the next critique of Reformism I have is called the seduction of isolated terror. So the argument that this is making is a couplefold, right? That when we view individual instances of violence, it's very, very easy to become seduced with, oh my God, this one person got hurt. We have to do everything we can to help to help fight for them. And I think, let's use George Floyd's murder as an example, right? The way that there was a sort of rally around George Floyd about that specific individual sort of disavowed the way that violence is gratuitous, right? There was no sort of one instance that can be justified, or it's not just one instance of it being used, but that the sort of focus on this one specific incident erased those of other people that have suffered from the same gratuitous violence, such as Breonna Taylor, etc., who have all been a sort of subject to this gratuitous layer of violence. So the problem here is that we over-focus on one thing, and we're like, hey, we've made a benefit, we've done something to change something, but in that over-focus, we disavow the way that violence operates on different continuums. The response to this that I usually get is, hey, at least we've made the world a little bit better, at least things have changed a little bit. How do you, like, again, I think this kind of goes back to the top. How do you understand what is change, right? How do you understand that things have gotten better? Metrics time. Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll answer that, Sandy. How do you understand change? How do you understand progress? A lot of people that like to use numbers, statistics, etc., do not realize that the reason that those numbers, statistics, etc., are reduced is because there are now newly legally codified methods of expropriating violence, right? That, I don't know if you saw the video of the police shoved down this white dude and his head cracked open on the sidewalk. They actually called, instead of calling it like a police attacking a citizen, which it was, they called that the man tripped, right? They're new legally codified measures that don't allow us to understand the scope of which progress happened. The argument that we are making and Afropessimists are making is that violence never actually reduces, but is shifted or is viewed to the back of our eyesight, so we don't actually see it. So does that stuff make sense? Let me. Cool. Then I'll answer Sandy's question, and then I'll get on to the next three stuff I have on Reformism. The stuff about you're homogenizing all instances of anti-Black violence or the experience that Black people have is just, I think, false. Because the argument is not that. I don't understand what the warrant is for that. So, Sandy, if you want to come off mute and explain it, it's like, why is Afropessimism that critiques the idea of the way that violence operates on a gratuitous nature a homogenizing of all instances of anti-Black violence?
I guess, like, I'm just trying to think. Like, have you read the Klein evidence that everyone reads in the 2AC? Or, like,
Yeah.
usually, like, stuff like that, where it's like, obviously, if you reduce, or if you characterize Black suffering in a specific way, then that only makes Black suffering, or that, like, reduces, I don't know how to explain it, but people say, like, oh, you're homogenizing all, like, in all experiences that Black people have, or whatever. Like, I don't know, like, how do you answer that?
Okay. I have a couple of thoughts. The first of which is just saying, no, we aren't. People can just experience the gratuitous nature of violence in different ways, but that does not mean that gratuity does not exist. Right? That, like, we are not saying that all folks are still slaves, right? That is like a very rudimentary and reductionary understanding of Afropessimism, but rather we are saying that through the grammatical constructs that have been created, uh, violence is inevitably constructed upon blackness because blackness has been reduced to the idea of criminal. That is not a homogenization of violence, but that is an explanatory analytic for why violence gets carried out, if that makes sense. And I also just don't think, yeah, go ahead.
I just said, yeah, that makes sense.
I also don't think that the sort of Klein evidence is responsive to Afro-pessimist critique for a couple of reasons. Because one, it sort of is a critique of calling things ontological. This is why the distinction I made above was super important, right? In the beginning, I said blackness was not ontological, but rather hyperfluid in order to make the idea of humanity ontological, which is why I think you will link turn that evidence at best. And the second stuff about creating micrological communities of care and stuff, the Klein evidence also talks about. I'll get to in the bottom, but I think reformism does not allow us to actually do that. So I've just created a new invitation that I'm going to copy and paste for y'all. But this is where we're going to be hopping on the next Zoom call to. That's the new link. Same password and stuff. Just because this meeting's about to end. So if everyone could hop on that, that'd be great.